It's obvious that you listen to this show to hear about and support other people's dreams. But what about yours? What is your dream project? I'm here to help you break through whatever is in the way of your dreams and get you to the finish line. Go to dreamingbigcoaching.com today and take the first step. Literally, it's a button you can click to sign up for a free consultation with me. Let's find out if I can help you reach your goal. Click on Take the First Step. It's that simple to start the rest of your life. Get coached by Rob Southgate at dreamingbigcoaching.com. Look, we're all nerds here. Todd Stashwick's Nerd Circus is a great place to pick up nerdy paraphernalia and groovy wares. How about some sweet lava lamp dice? Or maybe a funky 70s Rec Room Nerd Circus dice box? Does that do anything for you? Need a drink? What about the book Mystic Libations? Critical cocktails for the thirsty adventurer. Look, Todd Stashwick's Nerd Circus is the place for nerdy threads, cool tabletop gifts, and more. Go to thenerdcircus.com and check out the cool stuff. Oh yeah, and let them know the TTRPG Insider sent you. Welcome back to TTRPG Insider. I am your host, Rob Southgate. TTRPG Insider is a podcast about tabletop role-playing games and the people who create them. Every episode, I interview someone who's involved in the making of the games that we all love to play. I want to hear their stories about their lives as game makers and, I don't know, what they're doing in their real life, not just a description of the game. You can follow TTRPG Insider on Facebook by searching for TTRPG Insider. I also have a Twitter handle at TTRPG Insider. Shocking, right? I plan to add other social media, but for now, that's the best place. If you want to email me, you can send me an email directly to rob@ttrpginsider.com. This month, we're featuring Cthulhu Dreamt by Action Fiction. They have a Kickstarter campaign running currently through September 8th, 2023. Please support Cthulhu Dreamt, both financially and by sharing it across your social media. You never know who's going to fall in love with this game. So go to Kickstarter and search for Cthulhu Dreamt, or simply click on the link in our show notes today. Today's guest is Chris Durston, one of the writers of Cthulhu Dreamt by Action Fiction. Here's Chris. Hey, Chris, welcome to TTRPG Insider. I am super excited to talk to you. I love talking to writers, and what you're doing with Cthulhu Dreamt is super cool. Those of you that have been paying attention know that Cthulhu Dreamt is our game that we are featuring this month. All sorts of people involved, and Chris is one of them. Chris, why don't you tell people who you are and what you do?
I can try. So hello, everybody. My name's Chris, obviously. The most relevant thing about me at the moment feels like I've got a 1-year-old. That feels like endlessly the most important thing because she is taking up my entire life, which is great. But beyond that, I do have a day job, but I kind of moonlight as a writer, sometimes musician, editor, and somehow I've found myself involved with Cthulhu Dreamt, kind of through being a fan of some stuff that one of its creators did, actually, which is really weird. Like, you know, the power of the internet is such that I can be a fan of a thing, become friends with the guy who made it, and suddenly I'm working with him on the next thing. So
that is so cool.
Crazy.
Who was it? Was it Reed?
Yeah, it was Reed. So I think I discovered his stuff through Codeburst, which was like a graphic novel that he and a couple of friends did, and it had an original soundtrack. And I thought, this is so cool that it's a graphic novel. It's got visual art. It's got prose in it. It's got a soundtrack that's like linked in. It's this whole multimedia storytelling thing. I was like, that's amazing. So I just sort of reached out and said, I really like your stuff. And somehow we got chatting and ended up thinking we should make some stuff together. And now we do. And it's ridiculously cool.
I love it. And I interviewed Reed. The interview is on this feed for TTRPG Insider. And I could have talked to him for a week. I loved him. He was awesome. So much fun. In fact, everybody I've met through Cthulhu Dreamt has been just the best, and we're going to see if that holds up now that I'm talking to you. We'll see. Jury's still out, Chris. So a 1-year-old girl, that's awesome, man. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's really weird to think that everything that I remember of my life before having her was more than a year ago. That's weirder than having a 1-year-old. And like I said to my wife the other day, like, do you ever imagine stuff that we did before she was born, but you just kind of superimpose her into it because it's just, you're like, she must have been there. She must have just been sat on the floor rolling around, right?
Right. She's always been there. Right. You know what? My daughter just turned 16, and I can tell you, thank you. I can tell you right now, it doesn't change. I still can see and feel, that how babies have that like baby chunk. You pick them up and they're just like squishy and solid. And I still have that sensation. Yet it's a 16-year-old who looks like a woman living in my house now.
Yep.
And I also, my wife and I talk about it a lot because we had Molly late. We had her at 38.
Right.
And we had never thought we were going to have kids until we decided, let's try. And boom, we got Molly. And so we had a whole lifetime before her.
Yeah.
And you're right. You superimpose her. We owned a store that was so important to us. And we've talked about it enough that she's almost there. And that was 10 years before she ever was a glimmer, It's pretty crazy. So I get that. That's awesome, though, man. I love hearing that people have kids and that they're having fun with them.
Thank you.
Better and better.
Yeah, and I don't know whether you touched on, I think Reed's twins turned 8, I want to say, or 9.
Yes, we talked about how they might be the kids from The Shining. Mainly because of Reed, because he's introducing horror to them.
I can see that. I mean, it's interesting that you say that everyone you've met through this seems really, I can't remember the exact words you used, but in my head I was like, it feels like people working on a kind of Lovecraftian thing ought to all just be kind of really weird and sort of mind-blowing cosmic horror, but actually most of us seem to be relatively normal people. It's a similar thing with metal, right? Like it turns out that actually most metalheads are really well adjusted.
Yeah. It's different. When I was in high school, the metalheads were definitely what you think a metalhead is. My like the kids I knew that were like that, and it was like, and over time, metal has just become something completely different. And I'm always shocked at who I meet that all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, I'm way into it." There's a restaurant here. It's a gourmet burger place called Kuma's Corner. So if you ever get across the pond, you might want to go there. They play like Mastodon really loud while you're eating.
Oh, wow.
And I was never a metal fan, but I'll tell you what, going there, ripping into a burger that has, pulled pork, barbecue sauce, all that on top of the bread, and an egg on top of the burger, listening to Mastodon, you feel like a caveman, and it rocks the hell out of your meal.
I'm thinking it feels like that would create an atmosphere that would make you want to buy bigger meals just so you could have the like caveman satisfaction of tearing into them, right? So it might be quite a good sort of sales strategy, like almost upselling big food through. Yeah.
So where you're across the pond, where are you at?
Correct. Physically, I'm in the West Country of the UK. Okay. So this is it's the Shire basically. We spend our days climbing apple trees and cow tipping, and our nights hiding from farmers. Like it's it is what you think. But no, I'm very lucky to live in a part of the country that is, I'm kind of near enough to. Well, I live in like a city, although it's nothing compared to the big cities of the US. But I'm also like less than half an hour away from 2 coastlines, a bunch of moors and forests, and all that kind of thing. So I really, love being out in nature and stuff. So wouldn't change it.
You ever go out with your daughter and take a few steps and then stop and say, "This is the furthest I've been from the Shire"?
Do you know what? I think.
Come on. I would do that all the time.
I ought to do that with her, really, because it probably is generally the furthest she's. I should have done that when we went on holiday. Man, I know I've done it before. Have you ever seen the YouTube clip where every time they take a step away from the Shire, Sam says, "This is the furthest I've ever been from the Shire"? Obviously, I haven't watched the whole thing, but it's, oh my God, it's amazing.
So, all right, let's talk about you now that we've been ridiculous for a while here. Let's be more ridiculous. You are a writer. I was looking at your website, chrisdurston.com. And before we get bogged down into it, I'm going to tell everybody, I put the links in the show notes. You got to check out Chris's stuff. The links to Cthulhu Dreamt's Kickstarter is there. The links to Chris's books are there. Chris, I'm looking at your website. Read, listen, You podcast. I love this. Sometimes typey words, sometimes talky words. Yeah, that describes you pretty well. So
yeah,
let's talk about your books. What you've got 2 books on here. Which one came first?
So Each Little Universe is the first book that I published, and it's a silly book about it. It's actually weirdly relevant to you and to the things that you talk about, because a lot of it is about playing role-playing games and being stupid. Not that being stupid is relevant to you, but you know what I mean.
No, it is.
So
it is.
Well, yeah, I didn't want to assume, but it's all good. But that was kind of a not necessarily a deliberate lockdown thing, but I think I was about to kind of get to the point of being like, do you know what, I've just got to put this thing out in the world when lockdown happened. And so I think it came out in like April of 2020. So very shortly after we kind of all went into quarantine. So that was fun. But then through doing that, I ended up meeting a bunch of people on the internet. Again, sometimes the internet is good. And getting involved in doing kind of anthologies and collaborations, which I really like. Cthulhu Dreamt is something that could never have happened if we were all just hanging out separately. Like, it's taken, I don't even know how many people with different skills and disciplines to come together and make something that is greater than the sum of its parts, and like it could only have happened with all of those parts.
Right.
So Each Little Universe is like probably technically not an amazing book, but I'll always love it a bit because it kind of like without that I wouldn't have met Reed. So yeah, it's good, but it's basically about a couple of struggling inventors who meet a girl from the stars and decide that the best way to teach her how to be human is by being giant nerds.
You know what? It makes sense to me.
Huh.
You could rebuild society on nerddom if you were the first contact. So I love it.
Absolutely.
I love it. So then you wrote Chronicles from the World of Guilt. And tell me about that one.
So I guess part of me doesn't like doing the same thing twice, because it was like, okay, Each Little Universe is a comedy, it's silly. Chronicles from the World of Guilt is a short story collection, I guess, but it not in the sense that they're all completely different. So it begins with the end of the world when a giant space whale appears. Yes, I did say space whale. That's the premise, which sounds inherently silly, but I think when you take a silly premise seriously, you can come up with really interesting stuff. So giant space whale shows up. Everywhere its shadow falls becomes kind of twisted, Lovecrafty, weird. People go mad, dogs turn into demigorgons, etc., that kind of thing. I don't think that specifically happens, but you get the sense. So over the next kind of hundreds, thousands of years, the world just sort of becomes gradually more and more strange. And so it's if there's a narrative to it, it's just about the world becoming increasingly far removed from the one we know, and the space whale being kind of ever present, really.
So I'm getting a sense here that you like science fiction.
That's probably fair to say, although I think my kind of reading of the classics is probably quite bad, to be fair. Like, I've not read a lot of like Asimov. I've not read a lot of, I'm struggling to even think of other names because that's how bad my reading of science fiction foundational stuff is.
In that ballpark, though. I mean, it sounds like it doesn't mean you have to read that. It means that you have a brain that's looking to the future and figuring out weird things and creating fiction around it. So right away, I'm hearing Terry Pratchett. I'm hearing Douglas Adams. I'm sure you've read both of them, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And although Pratchett, I actually only read for the first time, I think, after Each Little Universe was published, which is an utterly ridiculous thing to do as a British fantasy-loving, comedy-loving person, but that's just how it went for some reason. But yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned Pratchett in particular as well, because the next book that is probably going to be out, unless Cthulhu Dreamt comes out first, because I'm not entirely sure when that releases. I should have checked. Oh well. The next thing that's probably coming out is a sort of fantasy story about a guy who runs a restaurant meeting a mythical wizard in a sort of desert fantasy setting, which is also a collaborative thing, actually. There's a whole other story behind this, but the potted history of it is that because of being in kind of writer Twitter, this one guy put out a tweet that said, does anyone want to create a fantasy world with me? And I think he was expecting maybe 3 people. And then 30 of us got together and built this world called Acton Tan, which is easier to spell than it is to pronounce. but it's a city in the bones of this kind of long dead Leviathan thing. And because 30 of us were all kind of bringing different styles to it, and like consistency wasn't really on the table. Like it was kind of, let's just embrace things being different. And that's kind of part of the whole thing. Sort of Vericonium-y. Like bits of it are really serious and bits of it are really stupid. So I think I was the one that said, well, if it's in the skeleton, parts of it are going to be in the ribs. So let's have a ribs restaurant in the ribs. So it's North Ribs is the name of the restaurant. And so
Of course.
the guy who runs the restaurant is now part of my standalone book, but I owe that to the 30 people who came up with the world. So
Okay, so with the 30 people, is it an anthology book or is it a series of books, each different writers? Or is it a book that just everybody contributed to? I know it's hard to answer, right?
Yeah, it's actually kind of all of those things. So basically the way it worked is everyone played a game of the Quiet Year to generate the work, kind of like a hacked version of the Quiet Year to work, not in, a tabletop setting, but basically it was around prompts from an Arcana type thing to like generate events in 1 year of this place's history, but you can kind of do retroactive stuff, right? So if in spring a card comes up that says an old member of the village dies, you put that guy in, he's always been there, right? Like, so Dolphin Joe, as the old member of the village was called for some reason, sort of always existed and kind of gets worked into the history. So this world sort of gradually emerges from like minutiae, which is really like no one sort of did, top down stuff where you start from a big scale. Everyone just starts with like a person doing a thing on a particular day, and somehow the whole world comes out of that. So we build the world, and then basically we all had the freedom to write stories from anything that was in that document or anything that wasn't in that document, as long as it kind of wasn't outside of that world. It kind of had to be in at least a version of that world. So that gets published in Tales from the Year Between Volume 1, which, yeah, like I say, has just a load of stories of all different genres. There are further volumes of that series in different worlds that were also collectively created. And then a few of us have gone on to do like standalone stuff. So I've done my one. Debbie Yanku, her dad, has got a series called Sands of Action Town, which is about, I think, a wizard who doesn't speak and kind of has to do things without speaking, I assume. I have read it. I can't remember the plot, though.
You know what? It all sounds awesome. It all sounds like something that I would be very interested in. And you are creating a new, we'll say, universe for people to get into. So I love that. And I love that you've got all those writers involved. That's kind of my favorite thing.
Oh, God, yeah.
Reading like Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions was a huge entry point for me because it's, 30 different sci-fi writers. And I started reading it and then I realized there were most of them I loved. And I had to go out and buy their books then. And it created, even though they were not connected, yours are connected loosely. These weren't connected, but in my mind, they were all connected. They became one thing. It was really interesting how that works. So what you're saying, I'm all in on.
There's something fascinating about that as well, actually. Like, so I've been in kind of a half dozen or so anthologies. Look at me saying a half dozen as if I'm American. We would say half a dozen, but that's beside the point. Sometimes I just do this. I just slip into it and I'm pretty sure that's how American people say it. Look at me trying to ingratiate myself. But yeah, so I've been
after you say it, if you should have gone off, that would be the American way, right?
I don't know what that means. I should have gone off.
Yeah, that was a joke. Okay, go ahead. I'm much funnier when I'm in the UK. Right? I'm much funnier over there.
Of course. Everyone is. It's just something about the weather, I think. But yes, I've been in, I think, about half a dozen anthologies, some of which were kind of all connected, some of which aren't. But there's almost some kind of like philosophy of literature point to be made about the fact that when you put discrete things in the same volume, the kind of like the format also almost like turns them into something that they're not. Like, I don't know, it's odd, isn't it? You take these things that are unconnected and you put them together and they suddenly feel connected. It's like that I can't remember the name of it, but it's that thing where people assume that subsequent shots in cinematography are connected, right? So if you show a face with a certain emotion on it and then you show something that might elicit sadness, they'll go, oh yes, that face looked sad about this. But if you show the same face and then something that might elicit happiness, they'll go, oh yes, that face looked happy about this. Because we just psychologically assume that things that are kind of contiguous, whether that's like chronological or spatial, are related in some way. Maybe they're not.
Yeah. And that's
I did philosophy and literature at university. I'm sorry, this is where my mind goes.
No, I love it. I love it. I love to talk about this. I love to hear about it. I also love that you are part of accidentally founding a indie publisher named Skullgate. If I had thought of that name before you, I would have Skullgate Media rather than Southgate Media because I love that name. That is awesome.
So that came from Acton Tarn, the village in the city, because the giant skull of the long dead creature is the gate through which people go. So it's East Skullgate.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
So the publishing company becomes this Skullgate Media. Yeah. So that's the company that's put out those kind of collectively created anthologies. We've not done for a while because everyone's got masses of responsibilities and stuff. But I hope that sometime soon we might come back to it because it's an awful lot of fun.
So I know I'm jumping around here, but I'm just seeing all the cool things you do. Keeping on the writing, you obviously have a relationship with gaming somewhere in here. Have you written any games?
Have I written any game? Not finished ones.
Okay.
I've given it a go. I've sort of dabbled in the kind of one-page RPG type thing. I had this really great idea for a one-page RPG, and then it turns out that there's something really similar that's really well known, which I only found out about after. I'm not going to name names because I might still do it, and then I can have plausible deniability.
Perfect.
But there you go. But yeah, so I there's a couple of ideas I have as well that I'm pretty sure would work better as games than as the kind of prose that I usually write. So I might have to kind of get into that. But one of the things I am hoping to do with Cthulhu Dreamt is write a side quest with the help of some people who are probably better at writing the kind of mechanics and stuff than I am. And then I can just sort of focus on the narrative-y bits. And then a friend of ours, Josh, is currently running a Kickstarter for a card game called Woad, WOAD, Stone to Stone. So it's a tarot-based journaling game about making a journey through medieval Wales and encountering druids in the English and various other things. So I did a little bit of writing for that, which was actually kind of really interesting. I would love to kind of eventually be on the other side more where you are, because I think as it is at the moment, I actually owe a hell of a lot to like the kind of whims and kindnesses of people I barely knew at the time. Like all the stuff I've got to do in the last couple of years is basically because I've happened to just kind of strike up conversations with people who it turns out are really cool. And they're just like, yeah, we would love to make cool things happen and for you to be part of that. And it's such an odd and kind of humbling thing sometimes to think about that, like, because Reed is a very effusive isn't quite the right word, but like he's very forthcoming with like praise, right? He really lifts people up all the time. Right. He's like, man, you're doing great. I appreciate you so much. And I'm like, mate, if I hadn't just happened to connect with you and you hadn't wanted to get me involved with this stuff, I wouldn't be doing any of this. Like, and it's just ridiculous to me that I get to, you know? Yeah,
it's so cool. I love everything you're saying to me right now. You're really touching the things that really light me up. The podcast that it shows on your site is Philosophoraga. Is that right? Philosophoraga?
Yes. It took me ages to come up with a name, and I think it's a really clever name, but it's really hard. The joke doesn't come out loud at all. So it's philosophy, which hopefully is self-explanatory, and then Phyraga, like the spell. Philosophoraga.
When I look at it, I see it, but saying it, it's kind of like your Action Town. It looks great on paper, but might be a little hard to say.
Yeah.
But I actually think it looks great. So tell me what this podcast is about.
Sure. So I think you probably can still find the episodes. I haven't done any for a little while, but I think they're still up. I hope they're still up. Basically, it's about exploring philosophy through video games, which it sounds like something a lot of people do, but I think most people talk about the philosophy of particular video games. They're like, what's Nier Automata saying about free will? What's Resident Evil 2 saying about dogs? No, that's Silent Hill 2. Anyway, but I think a lot of people talk about like things and kind of keep it in the game itself, and maybe occasionally refer outwards to like, you know, the kind of larger body of philosophy. I thought it would be interesting to do it the other way around. So it's like a philosophy 101 course going through the stuff that I learned, like, you know, in my undergrad degree, sort of one thing at a time. And it's explaining these concepts with reference to video games. So I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, I think I started
it's video games and philosophy. I see that.
It is.
And I You know what? Actually, in our first book in Pod Life, one of the contributors had a YouTube show that was a similar kind of thing, talking about philosophy, and like they went through the philosophy of Zelda, like they broke it down. So yeah, I think it's actually a great concept for a show. And yes, it's on Spotify. And yes, I'll put a link to the show notes so people can check this out. So that brings us to Cthulhu Dreamt. What are you doing for Cthulhu Dreamt?
That almost sounded like an accusation, didn't it? What are you doing?
What are you
Why are you
doing?
doing this?
And now explain yourself.
Yeah, it depends which word you put the emphasis on, right? Like, what are you doing sounds so different to what are you doing? Like, but
neither one sounds good. How about if we try this? So how are you contributing to Cthulhu Dreamt?
Good question.
That was nice and soft.
Yeah. That was lovely. So in a couple of ways, actually. So just to kind of skip back to a previous part of the conversation real quick, actually, something that's really interesting about the Lovecraft mythos that H.P. Lovecraft, the giant racist, started, is that it is one of those things that's kind of become a shared world, a shared history, because like even in, I'm not sure whether it was in his lifetime, but kind of certainly even before the books went like public domain, which they are now, like loads of other people have contributed to it and kind of semi-officially made it their own, sort of like what happened with Oz after L. Frank Baum died. So like August Derleth is probably the biggest one, but like people reinvent Cthulhu all the time, which I think is really cool, especially the ones who focus more on the kind of cosmic unknowable side of it, rather than like, it's weird to me that Cthulhu is the most well-known one because he's just an octopus dragon thing. Right. Like to me, Lovecraft primarily is about this idea that like the universe is so big that we can't comprehend it, and it literally doesn't. Am I allowed to swear?
Sure.
Like the universe doesn't give a fuck about us. If it knew we were here, it wouldn't care. Like we're tiny. It doesn't, like we can't comprehend what might be important to something on that scale. And so the stuff that kind of goes into that side, I find really interesting. Anyway, that was a completely tangential point. But so with Cthulhu Dreamt, I have actually contributed a little bit to the music, which is another thing I never thought I'd get to do. I wrote a metal track for
cool.
Cthulhu Dreamt, the band's second album, and I did a bit of like spoken word stuff on there, doing kind of a Richard Burton impression, saying things like energy is consumed to abominate, the stars have come to kill us, things like that. I don't remember exactly the words.
Oh, I love it.
But yeah, that was fun. And then the main thing I'm doing with the kind of overarching project at the moment is that I'm writing a novel which is set just before the TTRPG starts. So it's introducing people to a bunch of the characters that will show up in the TTRPG, and kind of, I guess, filling in a few world building details, kind of connecting some of the dots as well, because the way that the whole thing's structured is there's actually kind of a prequel in Cthulhu Dreamt, the metal band's first album, where the liner notes have a bit of a story about this scientist called Alya Mudamir and how she ends up going to another dimension. And that's a very brief kind of part of that. But the consequences of that are, by the time of the TTRPG, Cthulhu is here. And so Entanglement, the novel, is kind of about the time in between and what a bunch of the people who end up being big players in the player's story are kind of doing in that time.
Fantastic.
It is like, I'm sure other people have done it, and I'm just being naive and making big claims, but like I don't know that I've come across something that's kind of so integrated of a multimedia storytelling thing, like, because everything is in there now, right? It's not like we've kind of done a novel and then spun stuff off. All of it's being developed at the same time. Yeah. So it's all telling bits of essentially the same story. And like, I just think it's so cool that people are going to be able to have this experience of being in the story in so many different ways, like at once or not at once. It's just, it blows my mind that like this is a thing that we can do. I almost feel like I'm evangelizing about the power of the internet at this point, but like, yeah, I'm
what's the internet? Tell us.
Well, Tim Berners-Lee, like it. Yeah, the fact that I'm like halfway across the world from most of the people working on it, and yet we're all able to kind of come together to tell a single story that people are going to get to experience in this sort of seamless but massive way, just blows my mind. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, it's awesome. Power of the internet, you know?
Yeah. The internet is good sometimes, actually.
I talk to a lot of comic book creators that will tell me very similar stories. They're like, I'll have a writer who is in Boston, and they'll say my artist is in Ecuador, and we've been working together for 8 years and we've never met. And it's just because, once again, power of the internet. So, Chris, we could talk endlessly. I find you fascinating and what you do fascinating, but our time is coming to a close. So before we go, as I've said, I'm going to put all the links in the show notes, but where can people communicate with you? Where can they reach out?
Well, the place I'm the most active is currently Twitter, although depending on what Space Karen does with it, that may change. So I'm on Twitter at Chris Durston-ish. Because Chris Durston was taken, and I figure I'm at least adjacent to whoever that is.
Sure.
So that's probably the place I'm most active at the moment. But like I say, if Elon blows it up, which is entirely possible, I don't really know where I'll be. But I have a website, chrisdurston.com. I have a newsletter that I will probably have to make more use of if Elon does blow Twitter up. So things like that.
Follow Chris for now on his Twitter, but definitely check out his website. I had so much fun looking through it, and I've had a lot of fun talking to you, Chris.
No, it's been really nice actually, and I guess if there's a thing to take away, he said as if he was some kind of, I'm not even the host. Why am I doing this? But nevertheless, if there's something to take away, I guess from my perspective, is that like I would. There we go. My internet, my audio has just dropped out again. Okay, this is going to be Frankenstein. That's fine. If there is something to take away, I think from the whole thing, like, doing things with other people means that you can do things you could never have done on your own, and I think that's awesome. And just the fact that people have been willing to just on a whim basically be kind and be involved in this and make something awesome is incredible. And so people are good, I think, in general.
People are good. Chris, we're going to end with that. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. No worries. No, thank you for having me. It's been good. I don't often do stuff like this, but I always like it when I do.
Chris, thank you so much for coming on TTRPG Insider. I had an awesome time talking to you. If you or anyone you know has a crowdfunding effort about to launch or currently going, send them my way. I can feature their project on this show and on my other show, Go Fund This. I love to share cool TTRPG projects and to help people reach their goals. You can connect with me through the TTRPG Insider Facebook page or via email directly to rob@ttrpginsider.com. Please rate and review TTRPG Insider wherever you listen to this podcast. It really helps others find the show, which helps spread the word about our amazing guests and their incredible games. TTRPG Insider is a production of Southgate Media Group, hosted, edited, and produced by me, Rob Southgate. Thanks so much for listening to the TTRPG Insider.